Hey, good morning, Wayne. I appreciate you bringing me up here. Good morning to everybody else, or afternoon, late afternoon if you're somewhere else in the world. Hopefully, you can forgive me real quick because I didn't know my landscapers were going to be here right now, but they are. So I think they'll be done in just a second. But I have a question for you. One of the things that I got invited, and let me know if you can hear me okay, because I will need probably about 15 seconds before this guy is done. Um, Let me see where the chat is. And can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate the understanding. So great. Looks like he's done. I get to talk today about redefining masculinity. And when Wayne invited me to speak about this, it was something that I really was intrigued by the thought of because I hadn't really thought about it intensely before this. So I have some questions. If you could hit me up in the chat. When you think of masculinity, what are some of the first words that comes to mind? Some of the first things that come to mind when you think of masculinity. I'll see if it pops up in the chat. Pride, okay? Leadership, very interesting. So what maybe a better question is, what does it mean to be a man? So I'm sure some of you have heard, look, I see it now, provider, toughness. Um, but I have another question for you now. Have you ever been shamed for crying? Have you ever been shamed for losing, for needing help, caring too much about anything or somebody else? Feeling that sense of, or even better, and no judgment here, have you ever been one to do the shaming? Because here's where this conversation is relevant to where we are today, especially as Black and brown men in the world, in the United States, especially, um, and in tech, in corporate, is that it affects immensely how we feel and think about ourselves as human beings. And so masculinity is one of those things that when Anthony, I see you said when you were a kid that you either did or felt got the shame. For myself, I grew up kind of a typical, at least a stereotypical upbringing in terms of being a young Black boy in America. I grew up fatherless. I didn't meet my dad till I was 16. And I had several men in my life, but they were probably really quieted. My grandfather was the prominent figure. And so my ideas of what it meant to be a man came mostly through my relationships with my mother, my grandmother, the things that I would hear. And oddly enough, when I asked about that shaming, a memory came to mind of when I was a kid and my own sister. I'm second in line in my family that I grew up in. And my older sister, I remember her saying stuff like, quit crying, stop being a bitch. You know, I grew up hearing stuff like, and I hate this word, quit being a pussy, like those kind of things. And these are really, really painful experiences as as a young man for me to hear. And then now when I ask that question about doing the shaming, um, I can feel the intensity in my relationship with my own son, who's 14, where maybe I'm trying to come up with some of these ways of reckoning with this idea of masculinity. So let's get into it. You talked about all of those things like pride, leadership, provider, toughness, dedication. These ideas of what it means to be masculine are very interesting in their origins. And so, what I want to do in this conversation is open up some doors rather than really make some hard definitions. And the reason why is because when we look at the definition of masculinity, just Googling it, it says qualities or attributes regarded as characteristic of men. And if you look at the span of what it means to be human, isn't it true that men exist in all sorts of different iterations of life? Myself, I was a very sensitive, kind of quiet, um, tender-hearted boy, and I still am in a lot of ways, tender-hearted and sensitive, and I can see those qualities in my own son. And I don't know where we get these things exactly, but those are attributes that aren't considered masculine or manly. But let's look at where these come from. So I did a little bit of research into the history of our current notions of masculinity. And it parallels with something that is relevant to this discussion of us as Black and brown men, where we get our ideas about the world through the system that we grew up in. And this is some of the work um, that I get to do with my clients. And I work primarily with Black executives and entrepreneurs who are looking to move to the next level of their personal and professional evolution. And I submit to them, as I'll submit to you, that a lot of the reason why high performers or successful people in any right can't easily move to that next level is because they haven't reckoned with either unidentified or unresolved trauma and grief. And one of the primary ways that we have been traumatized, in my opinion, is through the ideas of who we are. And so for Black and brown men in the United States specifically, but I would even expand it to the whole world, the last half millennia of history on this planet, or maybe even more in general, but especially in the West, comes through what I like to think of as European colonialism, this latest form of going around the world and taking over, and anything that gets encountered that is not like what you are gets eradicated. And so everything that we have has been um, from this conditioning through the lens of particularly white men. And this is what I found as I was looking at the history of masculinity, or our notions of masculinity. Um, and so I want to just explore that with you, and feel free to chime in with any comments or any questions during this, because I want it to be an open conversation where we get to explore together. But here's what I found. When I think of a man, I think that he is a protector and a provider. And I'm judging myself based off of that idea of what it means to be masculine. And I find myself either being sufficient or insufficient. And honestly, have felt a lot of insecurity around those ideas. Um, but when we go back to the origins or histories of man, it's interesting to see where that came from. By stature, I'm a pretty sizable man, over 6 feet, 200 and something pounds, 220 something pounds. So with my physical body, yes, I am strong and I can do certain things that maybe somebody of lesser stature can't do as easily. And this is where being a protector comes in, that it's expected that as a man, I'm coming to keep other people protected. And one of the things that I don't know if I missed part of the intro that Wayne had because of my technical stuff, but I spent 10 years in law enforcement. And as a law enforcement officer, there are certain qualities that you are expected to display, at least to be trustworthy as somebody who can protect. And from my heart, I understood that. But from the perspective of how I approach life and how I approach people, it wasn't the typical traditional way of doing that. And so there were ways that I felt insecure in my display of masculinity. Um, and it was a difficult thing to go through, not being a typical quote unquote manly man, or in a career that is supposed to be protective of others, because I just never held that inside of myself as a protector and a provider. But where those things came from is that in indigenous or tribal societies, it made sense that the men went out and did a lot of hunting and brought back food and protected the tribe. So this is where these ideas come from. In a more recent um, understanding of it is this connection to European colonialism. And there were two camps that we get this from, in terms of the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire, and these ideas of what it means to be courageous or masculine or tough. And so I ask you, does it make sense to continue to hold these same traditional ideas if the way that we live now is different? So let's hold that. This conditioning affects us in all sorts of different ways. And I want to outline what I'm calling the mask of masculinity. And we'll just go through it real quick. Hopefully you'll be able to see this okay. So right here, and yes, I used the C for the mask because of masculinity. But this first idea is being macho. And that's this air of toughness, this egoic display of what it means to be a man. And we get this from, again, this idea that has come through conquering, come through a sense of superiority and other ideas. The second aspect of that is aggressiveness, that if you are a man or if you are masculine, you're aggressive. You know, we just had Ryan on and his career in the NFL. Like, playing football is an aggressive sport. And so thinking of anybody that's not masculine doing that sport feels kind of odd. So we associate masculinity with aggressiveness. We also associate masculinity with survival. That's the protection thing, like to help you survive. When I started to really think about this, though, it didn't make much sense, because if we look at nature, if we look at the world as it is, and especially with my own history, I grew up with a mom who took care of everything. She protected us, she provided for us. And I think also of like lions. The lioness, they do the hunting, they do the protecting. And I see Shamil, you said, I don't know if it makes sense, but you can't ignore expectations from your partner, girlfriend, wife, providing, protecting, accountability. It's what she expects. I have to keep insecurities to myself and find ways of coping with them internally. Beautiful. I really appreciate you sharing that, because this is part of the issue. Now, when you hold those things inside, they obviously reside in your body, and this will affect how you interact with the world, how you interact with yourself. So what I'm going to do today is submit to you a different mask for masculinity rather than this one, the macho, aggressive, and survival-minded. And this is what you're talking about to survive. Can't ignore those expectations. But where do these expectations come from? And having that conversation with your spouse, your wife, your partner of any kind. I remember when I did with my fiance, my current fiance, and it was really important to her to feel protected. But I haven't been that type. The previous guy that she was with was really big and tough and strong, and that's what she felt primarily from him. And so when I came in as a more mindful, sensitive, listening partner, I didn't have that macho thing that she told me that he displayed. But when I listened to her, when I allowed her to be heard, when I would pay attention to the little things that she needed, that's when she felt protected. And so really getting to the root, I'm inviting you to think about this a little bit differently, to think about it in a way that, yes, you can't ignore your partner's expectations, but speaking about them, inquiring about them, being able to dive into really the depths of what we are understanding is necessary for that sense of safety even. Maybe it doesn't have to be the kind of display that we're thinking. And if it's unnatural for you to do that, tuning into that for yourself. And we'll get to that when I talk about the other mask. And this last part is competition. And this is a big, big deal when I'm talking about the correlation between how we've been conditioned to live and think of ourselves and what it is that we have as a society. And so I'm not trying to solve all the world's ills with this. I'm really just asking these questions to start to draw out and open up a conversation that you can have with yourself, with the people in your life, and specifically with the men. Is how do we redefine what it means to be masculine? Because who defined it in the first place? It's not one of those things that is concrete. As you saw by the definition, it's just the attributes that are regarded as characteristic of men. When you think of the word masculine, if I look that up, it's just the traditional qualities of what it means to be a man. And then we put that idea onto something else. But again, if these are from a historical standpoint, if these are from a kind of world that no longer exists in the same way for us, at least here in the West or in the United States or wherever you are that you're listening, you're in tech. So this is building the future. This is stuff that are you're moving through technologies and finding new innovative ways of doing things. To apply that same way of being to this idea of masculinity for yourself. And I know you've heard of the term toxic masculinity. And so this is one of those points that I've really started to think through, like how can masculinity be toxic? And it just shows you there are certain characteristics and qualities of being masculine. But toxic masculinity means that all masculinity is not toxic. And so what is a form of masculinity that you can adopt and display that's actually contributive to your sense of well-being, contributive to your sense of who you are? And where this landed for me, and I'll tell this really quick story. My days in law enforcement, I had a moment. I was the detective for the last half of my career, and I was interviewing a woman who, a white woman, and she was describing the suspects of a crime. Okay. And one of the things that she said during that, she said, yeah, he's a black male wearing this, wearing that, this height, this weight. And then she paused and she was like, but he's light skinned like you. And I was like, light skinned like me. Okay. I don't know what that means, but we'll just go ahead and just write that down, light skinned. And she referred to my skin tone as light. I didn't think of myself as light skinned. It was 2 weeks later that I was sitting in front of a same situation, but in front of a young black female. And she said the exact same thing, the exact same way. Black male wearing this height, this weight, but he's light skinned like you. And I was like, what? And it literally sent me into this whirlwind of thoughts about who I believed I was versus who I was perceived to be. They were telling me I was light skinned, but in my mind, I was black. I was as black as my beard, or most of it at least, because you see the salt there. And it showed me how we are conditioned actually contributes to how we think of ourselves. But then I started to look around. And I was like, what does it even mean to be black in America? And I learned about the history of race and the creation of race, the creation of whiteness. And we are in this place right now in society, in my opinion, where we are reforming a lot of the things that have been unhealthy for us. And so I invite you to do the same with this idea of masculinity. That being a man and being masculine is almost synonymous if the definition of masculinity is characteristics that are considered a men. So then how is it you as a man, a male of any kind, can do anything that's not masculine? Even more importantly, masculine and feminine exist in us. And Phil, you said you had an experience like that in Asia, referring to being called light-skinned or having a question of what the blackness is that you embody, where you see yourself differently than other people see you. I appreciate you sharing that. So I'm going to wrap up here in just a few minutes, but I want to go back into the mask that I think will be helpful for us as black and brown men specifically. Instead of macho, instead of aggressive, instead of this survival mentality, and instead of competition, let this first M be about mastery. That as having our minds on a sense of mastery, where we are getting to know ourselves, where we're getting to get really, really acquainted and master the things that we have inside of us. So I'm not really playing to the world outside as much. I'm interacting with it, but I'm really about getting to know and mastering the things that are in me, including my ideas about myself and the world primarily. And instead of being aggressive, as a form of an aspect of masculinity? What if it was artistic? And by artistic, I don't just mean drawing and designing things and things of that nature. No, I mean having a view of the world where I am actually interacting in a way that flows. There's a certain way that things can be formulaic, but masculinity is not one of them. There is an art form to being human, and therefore there's an art form to being masculine. The S, this one's going to be an interesting one. Call it self-trust. So if you really, really get quiet and learn how to listen to yourself, understanding the messages that you have received from the outside, and instead of primarily playing to those, really getting deeply acquainted with who you are as a human being and learning how to take action on those things. This is kind of that trust your gut type thing. We're getting in the practice of actually taking action on the things that are inside of you versus what you think you have to do to be accepted on the outside. This is powerful, powerful, powerful stuff. And the more you do it, the more you take the chances of really stepping out and trusting yourself in the deep parts of who you are. What gets revealed is your most authentic way of being. And again, as a man doing anything, how can you not be masculine? Now, last one. And this is probably one of the most important ones, in my opinion. So I'm going to do collaboration and creativity. Creativity. All right. I think I got that right. Creativity. Ultimately, we're designing the world as it is. You, as in the tech industry, know that more than anybody probably, because there's all these innovations over the last couple decades that have come primarily because of advancements in technology. And so whatever role you play in your company, whatever role you play in the work that you do, having that creative mindset is a must, especially in terms of how it relates to people. So what if being masculine was about this? Was about mastery of self, was about having an artistic way of approaching the world, trusting who you are inside, and then collaborating and creatively interacting with others in the world versus being in competition. So that's my opening of this conversation. This is something that we could go into for hours, I'm sure. But redefining masculinity for yourself is vital, in my opinion, to a sense of well-being because of how the world has been created, because of the way in which we've lived inside of the society that we exist in, especially in the West. And I'm speaking primarily as an American Black male. And we've seen the unhealthy ways that the sort of macho, aggressive way of being is not healthy for us individually and for us as communities. And so I appreciate you, Shamil. Thank you, brother. And I see you, Matt. You said I have had the same thing as a Latino. People mostly think I'm not Latino and either white or Middle Eastern. Yeah, yeah. Call into question everything that, I guess I didn't finish that story. I apologize. I'll go back. So that idea of being Black and realizing that the way I saw myself wasn't the way I was seen brought me to a place where I realized that all of the information that I have about who I am has come through this system that has historically subjugated and utilized people that look like me for fuel for the economy, fuel for their livelihood and lifestyle. So it made sense that I would be conditioned to not see myself as human and to see myself as something that was an object. And so what I had to do, and this is what I would invite any of you to, is to have the courage, because what I did was I just took all my beliefs and I realized that everything came from this system. And I suspended all of those beliefs about myself, about the world, and it produced some of the deepest sense of peacefulness, the deepest sense of mostly peace and freedom, to where now I can interact with the world and not have a sense of deep, deep, deep fear that everything is going wrong because I just look around. How we've been conditioned as Black and brown men in this society to see ourselves as inferior, to see ourselves as objects rather than human beings. That is the core component, in my opinion, for restoring and healing this sense of who we really are, which is powerful and beautiful human beings who have and continue to create some of the most um, innovative and beautiful things that exist. So, thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. Um, I'm really grateful to Wayne and the Icon Project and all of the stuff that I'm seeing and hearing here. It's been a pleasure. And with that,